From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Unconquered with Doc Staples. As always, this podcast brought to you by Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. EPR Creations, Louis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida. Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina. Now, I don't normally do a second thoughts day after type podcast. I normally take a couple days to take a closer look at a game and bring in second thoughts, that sort of thing, after the hot takes the night of. But this is a different situation. I want to go into some things on this podcast that I think are worth spending some time on. And I've been seeing so much on social media, and I've been getting so many messages and so on, that I just want to address some stuff. I woke up thinking about this morning, and I think it's worth a fuller discussion in terms of how things got to where they are. You know, how do you go from 13-0 to this 1-5 in your last 6 games and not competitive in most of them? How do things fall off that fast? And yes, I've observed that it's, you don't have playmakers running around out there. You don't have a variety of different things, but I think there's a bigger issue in play here that I want to highlight in this particular discussion. And it's something that I actually talked about back in January as a possibility, as a concern that I had. And I'm actually going to play a clip of that episode in this episode, and then I'll link to that episode in the show notes. But the main thing I want to talk about at this point is why Mike Norvell looks and seems so different, and why this team looks so vastly different from previous Mike Norvell coach teams. There have been people talking about this a good bit on social media, that Norvell doesn't look the same, etc. He looks like a broken man, etc. All these things. What happened to the old Mike Norvell and so on. What we're going to talk about on at least in the first part of this show is exactly that. I'm going to offer my theory on essentially what has happened in the Florida State program and what has happened to Mike Norvell. And I think it basically boils down to one thing. And I'm going to start from my own experience as a teaching professor at a university, as a parallel to explain what I think has happened at Florida State and what's happened with Mike Norvell. So what I want to do is I want to take you back to about 2019. And in the classroom, most classrooms in universities, in high schools, middle schools, and so on worked essentially the same way. Here's the syllabus. Here's your expectations for attendance. Here's your homework assignments and when they're due. Here's the due dates for your larger projects and papers or whatever. These are exam dates. And then you either meet these standards or you don't meet these standards. And based on how well you meet these standards, these are the grades that you're going to get. Pretty basic. And then COVID-19 happened. And there was a nationwide, really worldwide panic. And all of a sudden you had schools shutting down. You had everybody going to Zoom. You had all sorts of upheaval in the way that things were done. And there was an awful lot of pressure on instructors, on teachers, to relax the expectations for students. There was an awful lot of, look, it's a really hard time for everybody. We all know that everybody's scared. Everybody is pressed for all sorts of, they're getting pulled all sorts of different ways. We've got all these different things. So above all else, err on the side of leniency. Relax the expectations. Understand that the students, it's hard for everybody. And so instead of saying, here's the standard, here's the same standard that everybody's had to meet in this class every other time I've taught it. Well, if that student doesn't really want to attend on Zoom or misses a bunch of those opportunities or doesn't turn things in on time or whatever, just give them a pass. And I had colleagues, I had friends in university teaching who essentially eliminated all standards from their classes in terms of grade expectations. I mean, there were whole classes that just everybody got A's because you know what? It's a really hard time and we just all need to be in this together. I know you're hurting right now. I know this is difficult. I know everybody's depressed and anxious and so on. So let's just, here's how this is going to go. And there was a lot of pressure to go that direction. Now, I was one of the few people at the time who had some concerns about that direction and didn't think it was healthy to do that. So I didn't really follow that particular approach. Nevertheless, it's still, there was some unavoidable slippage for everybody. And now what's happened since everybody has come back on campuses and schools reopened and everything is back in person and all of that, what's happened is it's gotten really, really, really hard to put that genie back in the bottle. After things got so lax and the standards got lowered so much and the bar dropped so much, it's been next to impossible to recover to where things were before. Asking students, for example, to come to class and to actually be present is controversial now. And there's whole articles now on the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I know a bunch of you out there are high school teachers, coaches, middle school teachers, elementary school teachers. You all know what I'm talking about here. Because it's not just at the university level, but there are articles virtually every week on the Chronicle of Higher Education that are talking about, like, okay, now that we're back from the pandemic, it appears it's been really, really difficult. Like, we've got to figure out ways of reintroducing things like grades and expecting students to attend classes and turn things in on time and all of that. But it's been really hard because students just expect to get a pass all the time now. And it's like, well, yeah, it says that that's the due date, but, I didn't want to do it there, or I had, anxiety about the paper and so on. And I know I haven't done it and it's a month late, but, obviously I need to do this. Is there any way that you can write it with me? Or these sorts of things. And obviously I'm exaggerating a little bit, but only a little bit there. And the lesson here is that once students weren't held accountable for basic things during the COVID-19 panic, they got used to that. And now raising those standards back to say, okay, you need to meet these expectations with accountability results in pushback, anxiety, shock, difficulty coping, etc. All of those things. The coddling that happened during all of that has made it very difficult to hold to a standard since. Now, I will say it's gotten a little bit better this year. Last year was really difficult for people in the classroom. It's a little bit better this year than it was, but it's still not it's still not the same that it was before all the pandemic stuff happened. Now, I lead with that because I think that is very much similar to what has happened with Mike Norvell and the Florida State football program. Mike Norvell, when he took over at Florida State, took over a program in disarray, a program with a serious accountability problem, because Willie Taggart and that staff coddled those players to the point where the standard there was not a standard demanded day in, day out. And Mike Norvell showed up with a how you do one thing is how you do everything attitude, and an attitude of he's going to hold to a certain standard. The standard is the standard. This is what we're going to do. And if you don't live to this, if you don't meet this standard, then, we'll move on to somebody else and you can go. And climbing all over guys in practice, really demanding and demonstrating that level of accountability. That was what he built this program on. He preached the work. He preached doing the work, and that doing the work would ultimately result in the desired outcomes. but don't focus on outcomes. This is all process-based. Do the work. The standard is the standard. Hold the standard. And I talked about this back in January, and I'm going to play a clip of that in a little bit. And I'll post a link to the larger episode in the show notes. But basically, the travesty completely shattered that whole thing. Once the College Football Playoff Committee snubbed Florida State, that message was really, really hard to hold. That standard was much harder to hold to because Mike Norvell is looking around and you've got a bunch of just shattered young men. You've got guys who are hurting. You've got guys that are utterly devastated. And then you're going to come to those guys in that mindset, in that frame of mind and say, all right, guys, let's go to work. Let's work. Hey, it's the standard is a standard. And they're going to come back at you with, yeah, who cares, coach? Look what happened. So all of a sudden, Norvell goes from the guy who can play the heavy, the guy who can be hard and play hardball with these guys and really push and be the accountability, to suddenly feeling like he's got to be there to comfort all these guys. He needs to be there to help them through this really hard time. He needs to show them that he cares and that he loves them. And don't forget, he also is shattered by this whole thing. Devastated. I mean, you realize he's been doing this for all those years and he gets his opportunity. They knew going into 2023 that this was a push your chips into the middle of the table year. They went all in and they had the high hand, and then somebody else walked to the table and said, yeah, the casino has decided that your cards don't count and your money's ours. You played by the rules of the game and you were winning. You were in position to potentially take that whole table. And if nothing else, at least walk away with something. And then somebody walks over and says, yeah, they're going to go ahead and seize your assets. You're done. So Norvell's there. He's hurting. He's then going to try to meet his hurting players where they are. And all of a sudden you go from being the standard setter, the guy who's establishing where the bar is and demanding that people meet that. You go from that to being the coddler. And again, for a good reason. But then you add to that the transfer portal, where all of these, as soon as that happened to Florida State went through a little over a month of basically just doing what they could to hang on to the players that they had. Because all of a sudden, you had all these other programs circling like sharks saying, look, Florida State, obviously you just don't have the respect there. And you can't win there like you could here. So why don't you come here? And these guys start listening. And different places offer them a little bit more NIL. One guy actually left. DJ Lundy left and went to Colorado. And then he discovered that the NIL promises out there weren't really reliable and decided that he wanted back. And then you take him back because I get it, man. I get it. We're all struggling. It's COVID. We're all struggling. I get it. We're here for each other. And then you get other guys that decide to basically hold out and say, I demand more money. I demand X, Y, and Z. And you start to meet some of those demands. And now, instead of you being the guy that is setting the standard and in charge of what's been going down and holding everybody accountable, now you are essentially being held hostage by your own players. And if you come to them in a different tone or whatever, your sense is that they're just not bought into that. You're trying to win them back over and you're trying to win them with gentleness. That's been my impression. And from what I understand from practices and so on, that's been the case. And this is the same phenomenon as happened after COVID-19 with people in the classroom. And that is, once you drop that bar, once you lower that standard and you start to coddle a little bit and you do it for a little bit, it's really, really hard to raise that bar back again. It's hard to recover to what you were and what things were before that. Once that standard has been dropped, it's very hard to transition back and raise it again. And this is why, really, the travesty, the College Football Playoff Committee's snub of Florida State really broke this program, which is what I feared it might do in the first place. And this is what I talked about in December and January. And I'm about to play something. This is a clip of a show that I did in January, early January, talking about how Mike Norvell was going to have his work cut out for him and that it was going to be as difficult a job for him as anything he's ever done in his coaching career, maybe more difficult than even building the program to where it had gotten, precisely because of this phenomenon. That the message that he'd been preaching, all of a sudden, the College Football Playoff Committee put the lie to that. And they said, no, not really true. It's not about the work. It's not about meeting the standard and then you're just going to get what you deserve in the end. Eventually, it's the results will come. No, instead, it's something else. It's money. It's all of these other things. So I'm going to play this clip, and I think this one has aged pretty well, unfortunately. My fears here, I think, are exactly what transpired. And I think what you're looking at is the difficulty of reestablishing the standard after heartbreak and after essentially becoming the comforting figure. And, raising the standard after coddling is much, much harder. It's always easy. You can always get more lenient and give a guy a break. But when you've been lenient, it's much, much harder. Same thing with parenting. It's much, much harder to go from being lax to being strict than it is to start stricter and then get more lax. And I think they're just having trouble putting the genie back in the bottle. We'll do a quick ad break and then the show from immediately after the Orange Bowl back in January.
And I'll say this. If you looked at Mike Norvell tonight, or today when he walked out on the sideline, he did not look the way that he's looked all season. I've never seen Mike Norvell look like that. Just in terms of expression, Norvell looked exhausted. He looked tired, he looked hurt, and he looked like he was just seething with rage. And honestly, I would feel that way too. I mean, if given the month that he's gone through, it's amazing that guy, he's paid a lot of money for it, but I can see that guy just being like, you know what, I'm going to go somewhere. I just need a change of scenery or whatever, because what just happened, that was a dagger shot. That was a shiv in the back. And for that to happen, that's a guy who has been, like, his whole thing is this unmitigated energy and positivity and belief, inner belief. And that was just shaken to the core in terms of what he preaches, by the way that that this all went down a month ago. And then you saw him on the sideline, and you could see him trying to get that energy up and trying to coach the same way. And that guy coached so hard tonight. You could see everything on the sidelines still working the same way. He's still doing it, but you could kind of see when he was looking up, you could kind of see him with that, like, we shouldn't even be here. And I'll be honest, I do have some concerns about the state of the locker room, about the state of the team in those respects, because after what happened, this is going to be an extremely difficult offseason for Mike Norvell and for the Florida State coaching staff and the program as a whole. This is an unprecedented thing that they're having to deal with. But you're talking about a guy that has preached the climb, the constant pursuit of getting better day by day and focusing on the process of doing your job at the absolute best level you can. How you do one thing is how you do everything. All of that, focus on all of that, and then the good stuff is going to come with it. You're going to get the wins will pile up. Eventually, you're going to get the chance to play for titles, but don't focus on that stuff because it's all about coming to work every day, being grateful for the chance to actually work and show that you belong. And then from there, you're going to get what you deserve. So make it so you deserve it, and then you'll get it. And Norvell got an entire program down the entire roster to buy into that and to come to work day in, day out and put in that kind of effort. And you saw the results. You saw a team that was resilient, a team that, he preached response. All you can do is respond and, respond to whatever life brings you. And you keep rolling with that. And ultimately it's going to come out in your favor. Well, and he got all those guys to buy into that. And now he's got to go to a locker room of a bunch of guys, the guys who are coming back, to all those guys and go, yeah, I know it didn't work that way last year. I know it didn't work. But if we just keep doing it that way, it will. Like this time it'll work. This time you'll get what you deserve. This time the results will speak for themselves. That's a really, really tough spot to be in. And honestly, he's a guy who, sort of like Dabo Swinney in this respect. I mean, very different in a lot of ways, but in this respect, the level of positivity, of unmitigated self-belief that you have to be that kind of coach is off the charts. And all of a sudden, he's got to figure out whether he believes it still. I think that when he talks about the last month as the hardest of his coaching career, I think that's what really this is about. Is all of a sudden you find yourself, it's like a death. You find yourself going through the motions and I don't want to trivialize this because, trivialize actual death because, those of us who've experienced real loss, and probably all of us who are in the listening audience at some point or another, one of the things that's most difficult about losing a loved one, about death, is that you wake up the next morning. And then, a couple weeks later, you go to work. And then a month later, you're still doing the stuff that you were doing before. And it all feels so wrong because no, the world ended back there when my loved one died and when this happened. But the world just keeps going on. And that might be the hardest thing about death, is that you actually have to go on. You have to keep going on living, even though a piece of you died when that other person died. And again, I don't want to trivialize the reality of real death. But for this Florida State team and for Mike Norvell, what happened with the snub, with the travesty, was like a death. And I can just see Mike and the whole team kind of going through bowl prep and getting into, finishing out the year and no, that couldn't have happened. No, we're going to wake up and it's going to be we're going to be in the playoff. And then you go to practice and you're snap out of it. Got to keep practicing, keep going to work, even though what you were working for was just taken away, was just stripped away. And the hard part about that is now you've got to go back and figure out how to move on and how to attack the next season as though that never happened. And to bring the same infectious energy and commitment and buy-in to every day and to every rep, to every film session, to all of that. Utterly convinced and utterly bought into the idea that if you do that, ultimately the results will take care of themselves. because that's the only way to play, and that's the only way to coach well. And the hard part for Norvell is he's now got to sell that message again to a bunch of guys who just had a committee tell them that it's not really true. That's hard. So yeah, I do have some concerns. I have some real concerns about where the locker room is going to be, about how hard it's going to be for Mike Norvell and the coaching staff to continue to get the same level of buy-in that they've gotten in previous years.
I mean, I don't think there's really any way to get around that that's exactly what's happened. And that I don't think Mike Norvell has managed to find a way to get that message back to where these players have fully bought in. And that's why this team has looked so much like those Willie Taggart teams. Taggart coddled the heck out of those players. And the result was undisciplined, unbought in football that fell well below the standard that is expected at Florida State. And I think this team has been coddled. I think this has been a team where essentially the transition going from, all right, guys, there's a lot of pain. And again, the travesty, the snub, we're talking unprecedented in college sports to have a situation like that. Unprecedented. These guys are dealing with a situation at that time that no other team has ever had to deal with, and probably no other team ever is going to have to deal with again. Anything like that. To where they did everything right. They earned their way based on every standard that was in place. And then we're just told no. Well, you go from the transition of comforter for that to all of a sudden trying to re-raise the standard and all of that. And my impression is that that standard really never came back fully. And that if you go to Florida State practice right now, the level, some of the stuff that is allowed to slide is stuff that did not slide in prior years. And some of that is because you don't have the team leadership that you did in prior years either. But that's the big thing here, is certain things are being allowed that weren't allowed before, and it finds its way onto the field every time. And again, you all have heard me say this, I don't know how many times, but as far as coaching, parenting, any number of things, ultimately, you get what you tolerate. You get what you allow. If you aren't, or if you're allowing it, if you're tolerating it, then you're coaching it. If this is something that you're permitting, then that's something that you are actually ultimately encouraging. And that's where they are. That's what this team, that's the problem that this team is running into right there. That's it. And again, the travesty, as far as I'm concerned, that snub broke the program, which is what I was afraid of. Now, the question is, are they going to be able to repair it? Are they going to be able to fix it? I don't think they can do it this year. As I've said from the beginning, I don't see a whole lot of answers on this roster, on this coaching staff. And Florida State's pretty heavily invested in Mike Norvell. He's not going anywhere. But Norvell is going to have to rediscover, re-embrace that standard. And he's going to probably have to make some wholesale changes in order to be able to do it, in order to be able to recover that. And the difficult part of that is you're probably going to have to lose some players in the process because those guys are not going to like that transition. Now, I'm going to take a few questions before the end of this show. I'm just going to try to rapid fire some of these questions and comments that have come into me since the end of the game. And I'm going to do another mailbag here in the next couple days, but I'm just going to do some really rapid fire ones here. So first of all, get a comment. Better off to get a mobile quarterback because the offensive line has been trashed for a long time. The guys he gets from high school rankings may be okay, but they don't fit the personnel. It's sad that he can't recognize it. He hopes it gets better without actually seeing it get better. This is really a mistake. This is a regular flaw. This is a regular problem that a lot of people make when thinking about how to handle bad offensive lines. The idea is if you have a bad offensive line, then you need a mobile quarterback to go back there and rescue that offensive line from what it's not doing as well. The truth is that what you really need is a guy that makes quick decisions and gets the ball out of his hands so quickly that the offensive line's mistakes don't really matter. If you look at the best situation for a bad offensive line, it's a Tom Brady or a Peyton Manning that gets it out so quick that even if an offensive lineman completely whiffs on a block, the ball's already gone because he understands the protection, he knows exactly where to go, and the ball just comes out and it goes to the right person and it makes it easy. And this is where a guy like Cam Ward, for example, this team's probably undefeated with Cam Ward. Probably is because of that aspect. We've talked about this on this show for years. Great quarterback play can make a lot of other things look a lot better. A great quarterback makes an average offensive line look good. A bad offensive line look average or good. A good offensive line look great. A great quarterback makes average to good wide receivers look excellent. It's just the way it works. Great quarterbacks, excellent quarterback play is a force multiplier for everything around it. It all gets positive. And it's not a matter of they need to recruit a different kind of quarterback. They just need to get better players. They have not yet recruited a top level. They've not gotten a Dylan Raiola. That's not the kind of quarterback that they've been able to land. And I've gotten a lot of questions about this. So let's move to the next question. Is Mike Norvell not able to coach quarterbacks? Can he not develop quarterbacks? Look at other than Jordan Travis, who has he developed? Well, that's a little tricky because if you look at this, he hasn't really had a whole lot of opportunity on that because he came in the pandemic. And the first two quarterbacks that he got were guys that were available for a reason late in the cycle when he got hired. And he had about 2 weeks to land a quarterback, and he got Tate Rodemaker and then Chubba Purdy. Those two guys really didn't pan out, but you didn't expect Tate to ever be a starter at this level. Chubba, there was hope for, but he sort of found his way to not do so well. You hoped that maybe, given what his brother had been, that he would become that, but he just wasn't as buckled down as his brother. End of story. And then your next guy is a COVID evaluation where you're going off of sophomore film and he doesn't play at all in his junior year and then plays part of a senior year. And by that point, you're kind of invested in him and he doesn't pan out. Duffy, he was a miss. And there were a lot of misses in the pandemic because you're going off of very little. And I missed that one too, frankly, because he looked really promising in the sophomore film. He just didn't develop. And ultimately you had a responsibility and accountability problem there. So then the next guy that you land is Brock Glenn, who's in his second year. And you get him because Ohio State let him, cut him loose. So the big problem here is that you've not been able to land elite quarterbacks until really the best guy you've landed is your third guy right now. And you don't want to play him yet because he's a guy that played 2 years in high school. The last thing you want to do, and there are a bunch of people that are saying, well, then play Luke. No, look, the worst thing you can do with a young quarterback is throw him to the wolves before he's ready. It is so much easier to ruin a young quarterback than it is to develop him. And it's so easy to ruin a young quarterback by playing him before he's ready. Look at the NFL for this. And those guys go into the NFL a lot more ready than guys come out of high school for college. The key there, though, is if you really want a guy to come in and be able to be thrown to the wolves, you've got to get one of those guys that is arriving ready to roll. You've got to get a Dylan Raiola. You've got to get that kind of player. And they haven't landed those. So that's on them for not landing that kind of guy. But that's what they've got to be able to do. All right. Next question, and I've gotten this one a bunch, and I've been answering this question going all the way back to December, a variety of versions of this question. Will Mike actually make the necessary changes? Does he have the stomach to fire guys? If the commitment truly is win at the highest level, there's probably 3 to 4 coaches that should be relieved of their job the first Monday of December. Well, first of all, I don't think that number is 3 or 4. I think that number is closer to 7, honestly. And whether Mike has the stomach to do it or not, I don't think anybody can know except for Mike. But I suspect we're going to see quite a bit of change after this season. He's not going to stand pat. I think we're going to find out that he has a little bit more stomach for some of that than you might think. And look, I know stuff happens behind the scenes, and, you know, coaches take the temperature of potential hires and all that behind the scenes. And I know some of that's happened. So take from that what you will. Get some folks that are talking about an unsustainable and probably lucky run of hits that basically caused problems for this coaching staff to sort of misevaluate their situation. So first of all, I don't think that was lucky. They didn't get lucky in the portal. They did a phenomenal job of evaluating and assessing what was happening. And they understood. They were about 2 or 3 years ahead of everybody else in understanding what the portal could do or be for given programs. And they used it to its full. What they miscalculated is that everyone else started catching on. And by this last year, the market had changed so much and their first mover disadvantage had dissipated so much that ultimately that put them in a position where they were not able to reload the way that they had in prior years with some of the guys that they expected to get. So, you know, you might say, oh, well, it was lucky that they figured it out early. No, that was skill. The problem is that skill was then, you know, again, sort of like being the first Moneyball team. When you're the first team that's using a bunch of analytics, it's an advantage over everybody else. But once everybody else starts using the same analytics you're using, then the big market teams with the better players are still going to win. With the higher payrolls are still going to win because they're going to be able to get better players on the same metrics that you're using. And that's where they got. And they should have anticipated where the puck was going better, no question. But that's where we are. That's what happened. I've also gotten a lot of questions about whether Norvell will even know the right kind of guys to hire if he does make changes, and will he actually be able to hire guys who are dogs on the recruiting trail and all of that. And yes, I've got some evidence from behind the scenes that he understands a lot of that stuff. Now, I do think he needs to hold his coaches, his assistant coaches, more accountable to do the work, to make sure that they do that work. But beyond that, I do think he understands who to hire. The real question is going to be, given this season and given all the goodwill that's been kind of squandered, whether he's going to run into a similar problem as to what he did in 2021 and before the 2022 season, where he looked to upgrade certain spots and some of the guys that he went after who would have been dogs on the trail were worried about him having a hot seat and didn't want to join a staff that was potentially not going to be there the next year. And his seat is not hot right now at Florida State, even with this. But that's something that has to be considered, of whether or not he's going to be able to attract the kind of coaches that he needs to, given the way that this season is gone. And they need to figure out a way to recover a little bit of momentum just for that. And again, I just don't know how that's going to happen. They're going to have to find some way to establish some sort of accountability for this group that has not been there. And like I said, it's really hard to add accountability midstream, but it's in some way they're going to have to do that. I'm not sure how they'll do it, but they've got to reestablish that, whether that's suspending guys. Certain guys need to be riding the pine because of the combination of their attitude, all of this stuff, and their performance. But beyond that, they're going to have to figure out how to establish some accountability. If I were Mike Norvell, the one thing that I do right up front in terms of establishing an accountability system is I would curtail some of the post-game or post-play celebrations. I'd say, guys, until, like, we're going to have fun out there, but until we've actually started to do something that's worth celebrating, we're not going to do the lockdown gesture or sack dance or any of this stuff after any plays. You guys are going to have to earn that back. Because I think there's a whole lot of that's going on right now that just is a problem. But that may just me being a little bit old and curmudgeonly and wanting the standard to be the standard. I'm very much in get off my lawn mode. And you know what? I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap the show. I think that is exactly the sentiment to wrap this show with. Get off my lawn. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media. and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. I am especially grateful for those of you at the Dynasty level. That is Brian Leininger, Dave Blair, Jack Horton, Jonathan Kennedy, Lee Caswell, Travis Smith, and Tyler Kashishki. You all are far more generous than I deserve. Thanks to you all. You all are far more generous than I deserve. I'm really grateful. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening and thanks for your support. I made this. Former President Gerald Ford is dead today. He was eaten by wolves, just like Taft.